So thank you everybody for joining us. My name is Jie Huang. I'm an associate at Scott Legal PC. Today we're going to spend some time talking about the E-2 visa requirements and answer the top questions that come up when preparing an E-2 visa file. Just a few things before we get started. Some of you may know that the firm was founded on an E-2 visa 10 years ago. Our founder, Ian Scott, is in the US on an E-2 visa, so he knows exactly what you're going through. We have renewed our E-2 visa twice, and we can also share our experience with you. The firm is a full-service immigration firm, but we focus primarily on E-2 visas. We have processed hundreds of them, and we typically process E-2 visas that are higher risk, which means lower investment amounts. We have processed at consulates around the world, but our primary two consulates are Toronto and London. We will be continuing these webinar series, doing at least 2 webinars a month on different topics. So please feel free to check us out. At the end of this webinar, we will send out a few things. First, we will send out a PowerPoint that has all of the information that we will be covering today in this webinar. We will also be sending you all an E-2 visa guide, a comprehensive guide that you can refer to. We will also be sending you a link where you can sign up for the additional webinars that'll be coming down in the future, and also this webinar as it will be recorded. And finally, we will be sending you a link where you can set up a consultation with us if you're interested in pursuing the E-2 visa. So today we are lucky to have Ian Scott with us, who is the founder of the firm, who will be answering these commonly found questions regarding the E-2 visa. And finally, for any questions you may have, please feel free to add them to the chat box or the Q&A page, and we will get to all of these questions. Okay, so without further delay, let us move into our questions. So first questions for you, Ian. Who can apply for an E-2 visa?
Thank you very much, GA, and it's great to be here. And yes, GA mentioned the firm is founded on an E-2 visa, and I'm here on an E-2 visa myself. So I actually I'm able to apply, but in terms of the rules, the E-2 visa, it's a unique visa in that it is a visa that is specific to a number of different countries. So there are around 80 countries on the E-2 visa list, and those countries span all over the globe. So we have Canada that's on the list, which my E-2 visa is based on my Canadian nationality. We have Pakistan that's on the list. We have Australia that's on the list. We have some new additions to the list. There's New Zealand and Israel are both relatively new additions, because what it is these countries are based on treaties between the individual country and the United States. A number of other countries in Europe as well, some countries in Africa are on the list. Egypt is on the list. Morocco is on the list. And in terms of to get a complete list of the countries that are eligible, when we do post this video on YouTube, we will have in the comment section, or the information section rather, a link that can take you to a list of all of the E-2 visa countries. Now, the second thing that we look at when we look at kind of who can apply, it's just a very specific rule that I think is, it's important to be aware of, and that is a rule that only applies to this particular rule only applies to one country I didn't mention, which is on the list, which is the United Kingdom. So when you are applying for an E-2 visa and you have a passport from the United Kingdom, you actually have to reside in the United Kingdom to be eligible. So this is the only country that has that requirement. And then the final thing I'll say about this is that this particular visa benefit, in terms of eligibility and ability to apply, it really depends on your passport. So there's some visa benefits that depend on the country of birth, but for the purposes of E-2 visas, the country of birth is not really relevant. What you look at is whether or not the person is a national of the treaty country, and that is having an actual passport.
Right, thank you, Ian. And so the next question, which is related, is in easy terms, what is an E-2 visa and what are the key requirements to merit an E-2 visa?
Perfect. Yeah. So an E-2 visa, it's really a visa that is for entrepreneurs who want to either start a business in the US or to purchase a business in the US. And whether you're starting a business in the US or purchasing a business, the key thing that you're going to look at is investing money in that business, right? So if you're purchasing a restaurant, for example, and the restaurant costs 200,000, that you've paid $200,000 to the seller for that particular business. Similarly, if you're starting a business, if you are, for example, when we started Scott Legal, it was a law firm, and really we had to invest the money that was required to get the business up and running. So that's, I think the investment investing is a key requirement of an E-2 visa. I think that, another, the threshold issue is what we talked about earlier in terms of, are you a treaty national? We do get a lot of calls and emails from clients that are not from treaty countries asking about an E-2 visa, and they're quick conversations because they are not eligible. But you're a national of the treaty country. So after you've made the investment, the other key area for an E-2 visa in terms of the requirements is that you are going to create employment, right? So when you look online or you look at the regulations refer to this as the business cannot be marginal. And what that means, though, is the business has to be able to support employees. Now, with both the investment amount, the amount that the individual is required to invest, and the number of employees, the government doesn't set a specific number for either of those, right? So if you are, if you are, purchasing a restaurant, you could purchase a restaurant for 200,000. If the restaurant was available for 100,000, that would be sufficient for an E-2 visa as well. And similarly, for hiring employees, the government doesn't set a specific number, but we really look to over a 5-year period having at least 3 employees working at the business. The business also has to be real and operating. So one of the key questions that we get from clients is, well, how is it that I can spend the money before I get the actual visa? And, can't I get the visa first and then spend the money? But the government says that the business has to be real and operating. So it either has to be to the point of operational, or actually operational already. And so really what that means is that the individual has to actually spend the money before they actually apply for the E-2 visa. And I'd say that, there's some other smaller requirements for E-2 visas, but I'd say that, that those are really the key requirements for E-2 visas: investing, hiring employees, and business being real and operating.
Great. Thank you, Ian. So if somebody meets these requirements and gets an E-2 visa, how long does an E-2 visa last for?
Yes, great question. So this in terms of the amount of time that an E-2 visa lasts for depends on a number of different factors. So first, when you go to the E-2 visa interview at a consulate, the officer is going to decide exactly how long the E-2 visa can be granted for based on a number of different things. So first, they're going to look at which country that you are from, because there is a list, the government publishes a list, and it's called a reciprocity table. And the list indicates exactly how many years an E-2 visa can be issued for a particular country. So for example, an individual that is getting an E-2 visa that's Canadian, it can be issued for 5 years. An individual that's getting an E-2 visa from Australia, it can be issued for 4 years. An individual that's getting an E-2 visa from Pakistan, it can be issued for 5 years. An individual that's getting an E-2 visa from France, it can be issued for 15 months. And that was a change. It used to be 5 years. It was changed to 15 months because the government can change these numbers. An individual that's getting an E-2 visa issued from Egypt, it can be issued for 3 months, and we're going to talk. I'll explain that a little bit in a bit. But so the first thing that you look at is an officer, when they're deciding how long to issue an E-2 visa for, is going to be which country is the person from, and that would represent the maximum time for that visa issuance. The person can always renew the visa, but that would represent the maximum time for that particular visa issuance. Now, the next thing that's going to determine how long the visa is going to be issued for is at some consulates, and this doesn't happen at all consulates, at some consulates, sometimes when an application is submitted, the officer thinks that, well, it's an okay application, but maybe not a great application. And so let's say someone goes to the US consulate in London and they submit an E-2 visa application, and it's a service-oriented business. They have lower an investment amount and a business plan to show, who it is they're planning on hiring over time. Now, the government could issue the visa for 5 years for that individual, or they could issue the visa for 2 years and then say, well, we're going to give you 2 years on the visa, and then after a couple of years, you should come back to the consulate, and you should show us that you were able to actually hire U.S. workers. And once you've showed us that you can hire U.S. workers, then we will, issue you the visa when you go to renew it for the full 5 years. So those two things are really what govern how long the visa is going to be issued for. But I think a key thing to note with respect to this question of how long a visa can be issued for is the idea that the visa is what is considered an entry document only, right? And I mentioned to you that, for example, Egypt, the few countries, Egypt, believe Morocco as well, and Bangladesh. I'm 100% sure about Morocco, but Bangladesh, all 3 months is the maximum amount of time that the visa can be issued, the E-2 visa can be issued. But think of the E-2 visa or any visa in a passport as an entry document only. So that means that the individual can enter the United States during the validity period of that particular visa. And then once they enter the United States, then regulation takes over. And when someone enters the United States on an E-2 visa, they're granted E-2 status for 2 years, never more than 2 years, right? So maximum 2 years each time. So even an individual who has an entry document that says that they have a valid E-2 visa for 5 years could not enter on day one and stay in the US for 5 years. They could if they filed other paperwork, but absent doing something, they actually have to leave the U.S. after within that 2-year period. It's the I-94 validity day, and then re-enter the United States. So what that means, if an individual has a 3-month valid visa, it means that they must enter the United States within that 3-month period. And then if they left the United States, in order to re-enter on an E-2 visa, they would have to actually go back to the U.S. consulate and apply for a new E-2 visa. Right. So, so in terms of the timing for the visas, you're always going to have to look at how long the visa has been issued, but also every single time that you enter, you have to really monitor your time in the US, make sure that you haven't exceeded that 2 years. And it's very, very important because the penalties can be significant. We have clients, even, after we have E-2 visas approvals, we send out notices to clients in bold highlight that indicates that you have to monitor your I-94, because we can't do it for you, right? We don't know when you come and go, right? So you have to monitor your I-94, and we unfortunately have had situations where clients have neglected to do this, so that they were in the United States for 3 years, for example, and the consequence of that is severe, because what ends up happening is if you are in the US without a valid I-94 for 6 months, you're subject to a 3-year ban. And if you're in the US for a year without a valid I-94, you're subject to a 10-year ban, right? So significant consequences for just not knowing. Like, a person may not know and they inadvertently don't renew their I-94 by leaving and re-entering, or extending your status in the United States. And and the consequence, unfortunately, is quite severe. So something to keep in mind.
Right. Thank you, Ian. Now, to switch gears a little bit, let's talk a little bit about investment. So how much investment is needed for an E-2 visa?
Yes, great. Another great question, and one that we often get. So the one thing before I even start with respect to the investment amount is, as I said, we often get the question, how much do I have to invest? And I always encourage clients not to think of this as just a specific number, but instead to think about the investment requirement as one of the requirements. And there are a lot of things that are going to determine exactly how much it is that you have to invest. So the first thing that's going to determine how much it is that you have to invest is going to be what type of business is it, right? So the government says that what you should be prepared to do is invest what is required to get the business up and running. So if your business is a service-oriented business, then you would invest everything that is required to get a service-oriented business up and running. Now, all of you and I know that to get a service business up and running, I might be able to spend $5,000 and I have a desk and a computer and a monitor. I definitely need 2 monitors because I can't work without 2 monitors. But but monitors are only $125 or so. So, but I definitely need that. That's all I need to set up a business. So maybe it's $10,000 at most. But unfortunately, the government, even for service oriented business, which has very, very low entry costs, that's not going to be sufficient for most consulates. So we generally say that even if it's service oriented business, that you should look to spend at least $40,000. And, you might prepay rent, you might buy extra equipment, et cetera, but, that you should spend at least $40,000. But otherwise, if you are, the business is one that, let's say it's a landscaping business or a home renovation business or some type of business, you should spend what is required to get the business up and running. So that might require tools, equipment. So the it could be 150, could be more to get that particular business up and running. So you are going to look at the type of business, and that's going to guide you with respect to how much it is that you're required to spend to get the business up and running. And if you're purchasing a business, for example, if the example used for a restaurant, if you're spending, if the purchase price for the restaurant is 200,000 and you only pay 100,000 and let's say do seller financing for the rest or something, then that's not going to be sufficient because you haven't invested everything that's required for that particular business. So in that instance, you would be required to invest, $200,000 to obtain an E-2 visa. Now, so one thing you look at is the actual type of business. Now, another thing that you're going to look at is where are you applying, right? So if you're applying there, unfortunately, not all consulates are created equal. And sometimes, you go to some consulates, and I will not name the particular consulates, but some consulates would, laugh you out of the consulate if you had an E-2 visa application with $100,000 or less, right? But then other consulates would, are completely fine with lower investment amounts as long as you can show that you plan on creating employment. So, where you apply is a key, is another key thing that you're going to look at to determine what the investment amount should be. And then the final thing that you're going to look at, and this is why I encourage people not to just look for a number, right? The final thing that you're going to look at is how strong is your case, right? Because at the end of the day, what the government is looking to do, they're not looking to see that you just spent a bunch of money. They're using the investment amount as a proxy to see, is that money going to generate employment in the US, right? So so if you have a strong case, like let's say you already have employees, or we've done E-2 visas. We did one for this individual in Canada, where it's kind of a doctor's office, and she was providing specialized services, and she had a number of different contracts from insurance companies, and this was a particular disorder that extended for that was not curable. So it was something that the person would be getting treatment for a long time, and the business model was very, very sound. So she was able to invest very low amount at a consulate. I think she spent maybe $20,000 and had $30,000 or so in working capital. But it was a very, very strong case. Everyone, from the perspective of she had these contracts, but also from the perspective of the government's looking to see whether or not the business is going to be able to hire U.S. workers. And, an examiner can envision as we can all envision, every doctor's office you go to, there are people working there, right? Whether it's a receptionist, whether, other doctors and other healthcare workers and things like that. So very, very easy to envision that the business is going to be able to hire U.S. workers. So I think that when you're looking at the investment amount, you want to look at all of those three things in totality and make a decision. One other comment that I would just make in terms of investment amount, and it goes back to the second comment that I made with respect to where you're applying. An individual, for example, applying through USCIS. So in terms of, you can apply for an E-2 visa at a consulate, but if you're in the US, you can change status and apply through USCIS. And an individual doing that, USCIS is not too phased by low investment amounts. Like we can do a service-oriented business where maybe the person spends $15,000, provided they're meeting all the other criteria, but the person spends a very, very low amount, like maybe $15,000. And whereas it would be very, very difficult. We have done it before, but it would be very, very difficult these days to process an E-2 visa application at a consulate where the person has only spent $15,000. So again, where you apply is important, but looking at all of these three factors holistically is going to give you an answer with respect to how much it is that's required to apply.
Right. So a related question to that would be, then what would be some strategies to deal with a relatively weaker case?
Yeah, so I think that sometimes weaker cases have to do with lower investment amounts, or sometimes weaker cases have to do with the experience of the individual. But I think that one way to deal with cases that aren't that strong is to obtain more evidence that the particular endeavor is going to hire U.S. workers. So that can be that you obtain letters of intent from, like, let's say your service-oriented business, you obtain letters of intent from individuals saying that you are these individuals are interested in hiring you, or contracts. Even contracts are even better. It could be that you actually hire employees, right? Actually hire employees before you apply. Sometimes you can actually get letters from chambers of commerce, and those letters are very, very helpful because the Chamber of Commerce might look at your business plan and they may actually write a letter that says that we've looked at this business plan and we believe that this particular business will benefit the local economy, right? And that's very compelling for an officer because the chambers of commerce are there to facilitate business development, so that can be useful. And invariably, I mean, we've often had cases where an individual will go to a chamber of commerce and say, "Oh, I can't get the letter," and then we kind of say, "Well, tenacity goes a long way," and they ask a few more times, and then they're able to get an amazing letter that really helps their case. The other thing that we prepare to kind of bolster, showing that the business is going to hire U.S. workers, is a business plan. So the business plan can be very important to describe exactly what the hiring is and when the hiring is going to occur. So I think that that's another area that definitely a well-developed business plan can go a long way to assist with convincing the U.S. government that you are going to be able to hire U.S. workers.
Okay. So now we can maybe talk a little bit about the specifics of expenditures. So what are some common E-2 visa expenditures, and are all expenditures good?
Yes, exactly. So it's a great question, and it comes up often in many consultations that we do. I had a consultation the other day, and it was really interesting consultation. And an individual who wants to come to the United States, and he said, so let's talk about some of the expenses we talked about. He says, well, can I include my travel? That I've been to the United States a few times. Can I include that travel in my hotels? And if I went to Chipotle or McDonald's, could I include those receipts as well? So those are bad expenses, right? Bad expenses. The government wants expenses that are directly related to your business, right? Not your personal travel or even the travel related to coming to get the business set up. The other thing he asked about is he was not in the United States, and he asked about expenditures that were made in his home country. Right. And I think that those expenditures, we look at those, right? We, as immigration lawyers, we look at those, and, if we can make a determination that those expenditures directly relate to the E-2 business in the United States, then, it might be that we can include some of those. Another expenditure that comes up often is training, right? And we don't love training, right? Because sometimes people will spend a lot of money on training, and then that's close to education, right? Like I spent, GA and I both spent a ton of money going to law school, but I couldn't include any of that money that I spent going to law school on my E-2 visa application. That was my training. But so training often is akin to this, like, school, right? So that's why it's not a great expense. But expenditures that are really good E2 expenditures, rent is a great E2 expenditure. If you have employee payments, that's a great E2 expenditure. If you have equipment, like, so, your iPhone, Galaxy, your computer, any office furniture is good expenditure. Another thing that came up in the last meeting, one consult I recently had was, can I kind of include, I don't want to get a home office, but can I include some of my home costs to the expenditures? And I think that's not a good idea. Like, that's generally, it's not going to be a good E2 expenditure. Another expenditure that comes up often is a vehicle. And I think that vehicles can be good E2 expenditures if they're relevant to more than just getting back and forth to work. So if you are, for example, a home renovation business and you have a truck, or if you're a landscaper and you have a truck, then it's going to be a lot more relevant. If you're a consulting company and you're going back and forth to the office, that's not going to be relevant. Even if you're going back and forth to clients, it's not going to be as relevant. Even the IRS doesn't necessarily accept that as or they scrutinize it very heavily in terms of whether it's a legitimate business expense. But a vehicle can be included, but I think it depends. Some of the softer costs like advertising, any money spent on software, licensing fees, all of those very relevant. Business entity setup costs, all of those, I think, very relevant. If you have intellectual property and you spending money on trademarks or patents, all very relevant to the business. So really, and I think another question that comes up about expenditures is, can you include expenditures that were made a long time ago or in the past? And again, those are expenditures that we look at, right? So we do look at them, and in some cases we decide that yes, we can include these expenditures, and others we say that we think they're too remote or not the greatest expenditures to include, because there are consulates, there are few consulates that post on their website, do not include things like travel, meals, and stuff, because it hurts your application, right? So they're letting you know ahead of time that that's how they feel, and how they feel, even though other consulate may not indicate that, they feel the same way, right? That these expenditures don't and if people are padding their expenditures with those types of expenditures, then I think that what ends up happening is the consulate might feel that the person actually doesn't have a lot of legitimacy to their business, and as a result of that could really hurt your application. So
Right, definitely. So it is very important to make sure to go through all the expenditures and make sure that they're good. Okay, so maybe we can switch gears. Oh,
one
yes,
last thing, one
go
last
ahead.
thing with respect to an expenditure that is a very bad expenditure. A very bad expenditure is an expenditure made to a relative. Right? So, or yourself, right? Or a company you own, right? So any related party expenditures can be problematic, right? Because the problematic because if the government found out about them, the government might think you're trying to put one over on them, right? So that can be a problem. So
A very important point that we
yes,
almost forgot to mention.
yes.
Okay. So let's maybe move on and talk about types of businesses. Now, one questions that we get often is, what are some common challenges and tips for consulting businesses?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that I think that's similar to the kind of question related to what are some strategies to deal with weaker cases, or with cases when they are smaller investment amount. I think that it's similar answers here, like some of the things to show that you are able to hire U.S. workers. Then I think that also on the expenditure side, I think that the one thing that I think that people, the hardest thing that they can kind of wrap their heads around is that, well, I'm a small business, I'm service oriented business, my focus should be saving money and not spending it, and that's inconsistent with what you're asking me to do, like what me personally is asking, what the government what the government's asking them to do. And I definitely understand that. I had to go through it myself as well when I applied. However, I think that the mindset has to be changed to be kind of successful with an E2, because despite the fact that these expenditures may not be required or money that you wouldn't have otherwise spent, they are required to get the E2 visa. So, for example, when I started my E2 visa application, I obtained a leased premises for, I think it was $1,700 a month. It was in Manhattan, just a one-person office, and I didn't need it. I didn't need it at all. I was locked into a year, so it's almost, over $20,000 of just really wasted money because I didn't need it at all. Um, but however, I do believe I had a very, the investment amount was very, very low. And I really think it helped my application because I was able to include the security deposit and the first and maybe last month's rent, and then also, the examiner looked at it and saw, oh wow, he's committed for a year, so it shows it shows a significant commitment. So it really did help. So despite the fact that it was like a waste in terms of I didn't really need it, unfortunately with this visa, you all often are going to be put in a position where you're spending money that is maybe not needed. The other thing I think is that the E2 visa interview is very, very important, and it's not a foregone conclusion. No case is automatically approved, right? So for all first-time applications, the government wants to see you, unless you're doing a USCIS application when you're in the United States, and so having confidence and kind of being able to articulate exactly what your business is at that interview is definitely going to be is definitely going to be helpful as well. And then, as I said before, I think some of the things to spend money on that, maybe because people, I think one of the biggest problems that service-oriented businesses have is that they are struggling to find things to spend money on, but they can prepay rent, you can prepay marketing, you can like you said, hiring employees and paying them, but yeah, I think that those cover some of the things that you'd look at.
Great. Now, another question regarding the type of business. Do real estate projects make good E2 cases?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that comes up often. We get many different types of real estate E2 proposals. One that often comes up is that, someone, can I buy a house and renovate it and then rent it, and can I apply for an E2? The answer is no. That doesn't work. If it's one house, two house, three houses, it doesn't work because it's passive. It doesn't rise to the level of a business. However, we do have clients that have obtained E2 visas based on real estate and that same model, but they just have more properties. They might have 50 properties. So it is, it's moved then from being a passive investment, right? Someone just owning rental properties. I've owned rental properties and I haven't done anything other than collect the rent and maybe hired someone to fix a few things, right? But I didn't have employees, and it wasn't a business, right? And I think that that's often the issue with sometimes real estate, is that when the particular E2 visa has a real estate component, then the government might default to, well, this sounds passive. And I think what you're forced to do is try and demonstrate to the government that this actually is not passive, that this is something that you do need, workers for. We've also done other types of real estates, like real estate brokerage firms we've done. And, again, those can be fine. Sometimes you have to kind of navigate the licensing issues because sometimes that's required in order to be able to run the business. And I think that when we're looking at it, it really is the situation where you are looking to make sure that what is being proposed is an actual business rather than something passive. We also have done real estate like property management companies where again, they're managing lots of properties. So they're not just collecting 1, 2, 3 rents. They're collecting rent from a bunch of people. They have to hire maintenance people to fix the apartments or the properties, et cetera. So that's a big deal. And finally, the other kind of real estate business that we often see is home renovation businesses, right? So that's very, very common, excellent E2. I think that sometimes people will initially try to position it as a home flipping business, and that can be problematic because because of the reasons I started out with, kind of saying that it has to be business, so you might need multiple properties. And but a lot of people, if they're just offering home renovation services, then that can be a very good E-2 visa as well. And we've done many of those. So.
Great. And would there be any other risky E-2 visa areas that come to mind?
Yeah, so I think another one that comes to mind is, people who are doing like kind of equity trading type businesses. And I think that the reason that those ones are risky, similar to the real estate business, is that the government is used to seeing these as more passive forms of investment, right? So, and we get people, varying degrees of differences in terms of proposals that they're offering. But in some cases, like things to stay away from is if you're managing your own money or family members' money, then that can be problematic for an E-2 because the government, again, doesn't think it's a real business, that it's just going to be you. The other kind of thing you have to be conscious of is those types of businesses are often highly regulated. So I think that often the regulation is something that you do have to kind of bend over backwards and kind of make sure that, because the government wants to see that the business is real and operating, so they do want to make sure that you are that you have complied with whatever the statutory regulations surrounding the E2 are. So I think that those are, so I'd say that that's another area that is sometimes can be seen as a risky E2.
Right. So with all visas, there could be a possibility of an E-2 visa being denied. So in your opinion, what are the common reasons that you see of E-2 visas being denied?
Yeah, so the one good thing about E-2 visas is that they are very predictable, especially if you're at a consulate that is that's used to processing E-2 visas. And they are very predictable, and they have very high approval rates, right? Like, the firm approval rate is probably 97, 98%. Past results don't predict future outcome, but they are, I think even in the government approval rates that they post, I think the approval rates are over 80%. And that's, includes people that, have lawyers that maybe don't know what they're doing, or people who may apply on their own as well, because, it is a fairly challenging visa to put together. But generally 80%, even, of all applications is a high number, but there are reasons visas get denied. So one is, we talked about investment amount, right? So the investment amount is low, and this is particularly the case in some consulates. There are consulates that have very good reputations for denying E-2 visas based on investment amount. So almost that you may not even want to send your client there because of that. The other is nature of the business. So we talked about this a little bit. We talked about real estate businesses, but also equity businesses, but also businesses that a consulate may not fully understand, right? Where it's hard to understand how it is the person is going to hire employees, because not all businesses are straightforward as a restaurant or a convenience store or a gas station or something like that. So I think that the nature of the business is something that results in denial. I think similar to the first point where I talked about low investment amount, but the distinction is that low investment amount can occur in even a friendly consulate, but is where you're applying. Now, this is a big factor. Like, there are consulates in the world that are very, very difficult on E-2s, right? So even, very, very strong files submitted, and still, high likelihood of denial just based on where in the world the consulate is. And, and it wouldn't just be E-2s at that particular, those particular consulates, but many, many other visas as well. The other reason that is a problem, and this is a different problem from the first one that we've talked about, low investment amount, because if you have a low investment amount and you get denied, you can invest more and then reapply, right? So that you can often remedy that, well. But this particular issue is one that we've seen where the individual has a business in their home country, and then they're starting the same business or offering the same service in the US and starting that as a business. But they've had the business in their home country for a long time and never hired employees. Right. So that is very, very problematic and very, very hard to overcome. And we had one case like that several years ago. And we warned the client about this potentially being an issue, and we tried to do everything to mitigate that particular risk. But when they went to their interview in London was not having, they said, like, we looked up, they actually went and did some research. They looked up that the, the company wasn't doing well and it had never hired employees and had like low turnover and things like that. And they denied the visa. And the person, that was one of the few cases where one of our clients was denied and they didn't reapply, right? Because that is a hard thing to overcome. The only way to overcome that particular issue is maybe to invest in a new business, right? So I think that's another one. The other kind of question is kind of related to this, because the government, their concern there is that you're not going to be able to hire employees, but just that they look at the business and they question whether or not it's going to be able to hire workers, right? That's because this particular visa is all about workers, right? They may just look at the business and just question it, right? Like just question whether or not you're actually going to be able to hire workers. We had one client several years ago. He was denied when he first went, but then he was approved when he went again. But when he went to the interview, he was a management consultant, and the officer asked, like, so tell me about your business. And he kind of like froze, a deer in headlights kind of thing. And that was likely the reason he was denied, because the examiner said, well, if you can't even pitch to me, then how are you going to get clients? But then we did reapply for him a few months later, and he was approved. The next one is problems with the officer, right? So sometimes, like, in this world, there are nice people, there are people that are not so nice. Sometimes officers are like, there was one instance I recall where the applicant had a strong application, I would say. They were actually approved through USCIS and then went to Toronto to do the application, and they were denied. But then when I spoke to the person about what happened to the interview, and it was very, very clear to me that the client was not that friendly to was just assuming that they were going to get the visa, and their interactions with the officer were just not that friendly at all. The officer would ask him questions, and he was like, oh, I don't know why you're asking me that. It's already in the file, like, that kind of thing, right? So that, they have absolute authority to deny your visa for a reason or for no reason. So, sometimes issues with an officer can be, and it could just be an officer is having a bad day. I don't think that was the case in the example I just gave, but it could just be that the officer's having a bad day and wants to make sure everyone else is having a bad day too. But that sometimes happens. And then the final thing is just that the person applies, and I mean, this would never happen with us filing, but there are lots of people who file on their own. And the issue is that the person just didn't meet the requirements. Like we've had cases where someone has been denied, and then they've come to us and they're like, why was I denied? And then we look and they have seller financing or some other thing that's explicit in the regulations where it's not permitted, right? We had one application where the person came to us and their lawyer filed, and they weren't even from a treaty country, right? So the issue was that it was when Ecuador was on the list, but Ecuador gradually went off the list, and but the lawyer didn't realize that they were kind of off the list. So the person went to the consulate in Ecuador, and they said, sorry, you're not eligible. He would have had to file before a particular date. Sorry, you're not eligible, or whatever. So the final reason is just that the person's not eligible at the time of filing. So that's something to consider.
Right. Very important points. I guess we could segue into the source of investments. So common questions that we get is, can I obtain a loan or a gift for my investment?
Yes, and it's you can both. So yes to both. You can, your investment amount can come from loan, it can come from gift. A few other things with your investment, like some people ask, like, does it have to come from the treaty country? Absolutely not. It can come from anywhere. It can come from United States. The key is that you have proved that the money has come from a legitimate source, right? So you're going to be, if the money's coming from savings, you're going to be showing tax returns, or, that you were employed, and bank statements showing that you saved the money. If it came from the sale of property, you're going to be providing documentation for that. So and it can be, someone gives you a gift, that's not a problem. The person can be friend, relative, doesn't matter. And similarly, they can give you a loan, and the loan can be unsecured, or it can be secured. But if it's secured, it can only be secured, excuse me, against your personal property. The business can't be the security. And that's why seller financing doesn't work. So, the situation where, let's say you buy a restaurant, let's say the restaurant's 500,000, you pay the seller 300,000, and they say that, we'll give you a loan for 200,000. It's not the loan that's the issue. The issue is that the agreement is also going to say that if you don't pay the 200,000, we're going to take the business back. So the business is the collateral, and that doesn't work. Whereas if the person said, okay, well, the collateral is my this Porsche or this house that I have, a personal asset, that would work. But the collateral can't be the business.
Right. And the related question to that one is, and this is a question from one of our audience. So could I use a company fully owned by myself to invest, or must the investment come from my name?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the reason I like this question is because the answer is yes for E2, right? As long as you own the company, it's yes. But what's interesting is that a lot of people, in terms of when they look at options for moving to a green card, they sometimes look at EB5 as an option for moving to a green card. And the answer is no if you were doing EB5. So it's actually a bit of it's an interesting question in the sense of yes, E2, you don't have the person that you don't have to be. It can be, you can invest through an entity, you can invest individually, you can lots of ways to do it for E2, but for EB5, which is it's interesting that actually wouldn't work for EB5. So sometimes when people are moving from E2 to EB5, then if you do it that way, then you may not be able to count some of the investment that you have made in the past. So.
And we just have another question related to that pop up here on buying an already existing business. So, and we're assuming 50% of the shares of an already existing business. Is it even legal to purchase the other 50% of the company at a later time?
It is, yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yep, it would be fine. Yeah, you could do that. You could, I think that what you wouldn't do, right? Like you have to make sure that whatever the arrangement is transparent and represents exactly what is actually happening, right? So it's not a way to get around seller financing, for example, right? So there couldn't be like a agreement to buy 50% and then a side agreement to buy the other 50% with the business being a collateral or something like that, right? But if you bought 50% and then time passed, and then you decided that you wanted to buy the other 50%, that would certainly be possible.
Right. That is definitely a very important distinction that you just made. And on the same topic, we also have a very common question. Can I buy a business from a relative?
Yes, it's a great question. And so can you? Yes. Can you apply for an E2 after you do it? Yes. Are there issues with it? Yes. So the issues is the government sometimes thinks that there's nothing really going on, right? That it's not a real transaction, right? So, I'll give you a great example. We had a client that applied in Australia. She bought 50% of a gas station from her brother-in-law. And we warned her when she applied that this could be an issue, right? And she got the money from her mother. Mother gifted her the money, gave it to the brother, etc. We warned her this could be an issue. She went to the consulate and it was approved. She was approved for 4 years, right? They didn't raise it as an issue. They didn't bring it up. It was approved. So then during the pandemic, actually, she was renewing and she went back to Australia to renew. And what should have been a slam dunk renewal because the gas station had employees, et cetera, the examiner looked at the case and he said, this should never have been approved. Right. He said that, all this is money transferring around family. Right. I don't believe you really made the investment, and he denied it. Right. On the renewal, he denied it. Right. So that's the issue with transactions between families. The government just doesn't believe that they're arm's length transactions. And if you go to a consulate, they don't, it's not, the onus isn't on, the consular officer doesn't have to explain why it is. They just say no, right? They don't have to explain why it is. They don't have to, the burden, they just say no, we don't believe it's real. And then, you don't get the visa. So.
Right. So we have another question that popped up from the audience regarding the investment. So maybe we can answer all of them together. Can you use as source of funds income generated within that business itself, or would you need to withdraw it as profits and then reinvest? And I guess
It,
for this, it means that the company is already operating, isn't it? Yeah.
Yep, exactly. So yeah, so it would have to be like what the person wrote. They would have to withdraw it and reinvest it, and then that has to be a very formal line, and it should be over time. Like you shouldn't, you shouldn't, like let's say that let's say in 2022 you paid your, the company paid you money, and then they paid it to you, and then in 2022 you reinvested it the same year and said, well, that's investment. That probably is going to be problematic because they're just going to think it's an in and out. So it should be over time, so that you actually, you were paid a salary, say, went into your bank account, you paid taxes on that money, and then after that, the next year or something, you reinvested it into the business to avoid any issues. It could be that there are no issues, right? But to avoid any issues, when we submit applications, we like to submit them so that we don't have any issues, right? So yeah.
Great. So several other questions. One of them that we get a lot of times is, can I change my business after I start it?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's coming up a lot. We're actually going through this right now with one of our clients, where we're filing something to ask for an opinion. So the rule is, like, if when you submitted an E-2 visa application, you say that you're doing a business. So let's say that you say that I'm opening up a restaurant, or I'm buying a restaurant. So now, if you were if you're running the restaurant, and then you decided that you wanted to, in addition to running the restaurant, you said that you wanted to, for example, I don't know, sell t-shirts, right? Then, let's say you were selling a small amount of t-shirts, probably you wouldn't have to do anything, right? It's like we'd probably argue that it's not a significant change, and that, based on the fact that it's a, small dollar amounts, et cetera, and you're doing them through the business still, there's an argument you could make. It may not be one they agree with, but the argument that you could make that it's not a significant change. But now let's change the example and say that the individual doesn't want to run the restaurant anymore, right? So they sell the restaurant, and then they're going to start, offering consulting services, right? So you can't do that, right? Just because you just because you have the legal entity doesn't that has the E-2 doesn't mean that you can do anything you want with the legal entity. And so there is a process. Two things you can do. One is you can go back to the consulate and apply for a new E-2 visa if you're sure it's a completely different type of business, or you can do an amendment through USCIS. Three things you can do: or do an amendment through USCIS, or you can ask USCIS if they believe, because they will offer an advisory opinion as to whether or not they believe it's a significant change. Now, the example that I just gave, it's obviously a significant change, right? There's no point asking for an advisory opinion, because it's obviously a change. But there could be instances, and we're doing this right now, we're asking for an advisory opinion. The client wants to do this, asking for an advisory opinion, because the change isn't as obvious as the one that I just gave. So you definitely have to work very closely with your immigration lawyers, and sometimes it's going to come down to, what is your tolerance for risk, right? Like, in terms of, do you file an amendment? Do you go back to the consulate? Because it isn't, it is like the statute says that if it's a significant change, you have to do something, right? So then it becomes a question of what constitutes something being significant.
Right. Okay. So we have 6 minutes left here. I think there was only one more question that I would like to ask, and I think we answered all of the questions from our audience. So the question that's left is, we mentioned employees, but do we have to have employees before filing an E-2 visa?
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, so they don't have to. The employees don't have to have been hired before you file, but if they have been hired, they will help your application. So we certainly, for business startups, we don't insist on employees being hired. But I think, again, sometimes it's like, when we look at an application, and let's say there's a really low investment amount, then we might encourage a client to hire employees, so that we, as a way to deal with that very low investment amount. So I think that, yeah, I think definitely not mandatory to have them before. However, it's something that will help your case if you do.
Right. And related to that, we have another question pop up here. Someone who's doing software development, most of the investment is in salaries, so it'll be a future investment. How would this work in my case?
Sure. So there is no future investment with E2s, right? So it's what you've spent, right? So when you've either spent the money or you haven't spent it. So future investment goes in your business plan that says I'm going to spend X number of dollars and or I'm going to have employees over this period of time or whatever. But when you're submitting the application, you're only including in the investment schedule, you're only including money that you have actually spent at the time of application.
Right. So you would already hire those employees before
Yeah, if you wanted to
applying for the
include them.
E2.
Yeah,
Yeah, if you
exactly.
wanted
If
to
you if
include
you
them
want
as
to
an
include them.
investment. Yeah,
Exactly,
I
exactly,
think, yeah,
exactly.
that's what they were asking. Okay, one last question from the audience is, could I apply for E2 visa from the US during my tourist visa?
Yeah, it's a great question. We have, you certainly can. Definitely it would be better if you, because when you enter the US, well, let me go back. If you entered on ESTA, like visa waiver program, then no, there's no ability to change status in the US when you enter on ESTA. If you have a B1/B2 visa in your passport, it's always going to say B1/B2. Then when you enter the US, they're going to ask you, why are you coming? If you said, like, I'm going to Disneyland, they'll admit you on B2. If you said I'm coming to the US because I want to explore E2 visa options, they'll admit you on B1. It's always best to be admitted on B1 because then you'll have no problems if you do plan on changing status later. But we've often changed status of people that are on B2. It's just we have to be a bit more careful of how we position the business plan or contracts, and because we wouldn't want to submit a change of status application with a bunch of signatures from the applicant, because the government might then conclude that they're performing activities that are not permitted under B2, but are permitted under B1. But definitely we've done lots of applications for people moving from B2 to E2.
All right. So I think that was all of it that we've asked and answered. I think there was one question here that I think we answered live. So all of the questions have been answered. If there's
Excellent.
maybe, is there any other question from the audience anyone would like answered before we close?
Great. No,
I
excellent.
don't believe so. Yeah.
No,
So
perfect.
thank you so much, Ian.
Thank you very much. And as Jay said, this will be recorded and posted as a video on YouTube. So definitely keep an eye out for it. Usually we send them out the same day or the next day. So yeah, and definitely if you have any questions or you could definitely set up a consultation with us. We'd be happy to help.
Great. Thank you.
Great.
Thank
Thank
you,
you. Thank you very
everyone.
much, Jay. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.